So today we have two speakers. Our first speaker is Nadia Larichi. She has a PhD degree from Polytechnique Montréal, where she is also a professor. And her research interests are in the application of modeling and operational research tools in healthcare. Thank you.
You're welcome. Donc ça c'est bon ça? Ah, un peu plus. Ok, c'est bon. Merci. Merci à tous. Who doesn't speak French? Do I have? Okay, of course. Of course. Okay, so I have at least two here. Okay, so my first question, just before I start, is who's here for the operations research part? Who's here for the healthcare part? Perfect. So it means that for the operations research part, we can just discuss it later. I will just have really the focus on the healthcare one, since most of people are here for that. So this is a joint work with the master's student, Fanny, who's finished now, and the postdoc, my colleague of mine, Louis Martin, and Jean-Marc Chauny, who's from the hospital Sacré-Cœur. So this is a joint work with Sacré-Cœur. And I'm from Polytechnique, as Margarita, she just said, and I'm a member of CIRELT and a member of the research chair in healthcare. Okay, so the outline, I give you a little bit of background on the emergency room in Quebec, even though you already know. A bit on the problem definition and how we solved the scheduling problem, and some results. So I usually have to present this for people who may not know how the Quebec system works, so I always go with that we're now really number one on the wait times in the emergency room. So usually how the emergency room is evaluated is that you would look at some metrics, and one of the metrics is the wait time, and how many people are waiting on the stretchers, for example. And so one of the metrics is how many people are waiting for more than 5 hours or 2 hours or 48 hours or so on. But just to give you numbers, so we have 44% of people in Quebec waiting more than 5 hours. So this wait time, obviously we do have many ideas of what happens, but we're only focusing on one of these problems. We do have other metrics, which are the patients who are leaving without being seen. So the patients, they arrive to the ED, they see that they will have to wait too long, they prefer to just go and then they're not treated. So this is not good in terms of performance, and this is one of the main reasons and one of the challenges to be looking to solve this problem. Sorry, it's not mine, so I'm not really used to it. It's not this one. Okay, so why do we have ED overloaded? So everybody has a reason, everybody knows why, but mainly, if I really have to look at these reasons, it's the patient journey. So you may have many physicians, many consults, many tests to undergo once you go to the ED. So this creates a bit of a bottleneck. You would have the availability of beds, because obviously the emergency, even though we tend to look at it as being one whole system, is linked to the rest of the hospital. So you may be waiting in the ED because you're actually waiting for a bed to become available, and the bed is not available because nobody's coming to pick up the patient to go back home, for example. So this whole thing is a complete trajectory that has to be looked at. You could have the physical configuration of the emergencies, because then you have to go all around. So I hope that none of you have been there, but if you have, then you would know that you have different rooms and then the tests and where the papers are. So this creates a bit of a bottleneck in the work. And the problem that I will be focusing on today is the match between the medical resources with the patient's demand. So the medical resources, I'm not looking to solve the nurse's problem or whoever is not a physician. So we are really focusing on the physician scheduling and how do we schedule these physicians to match basically the offer with the demand. So before I go into details, I just want you to know that we're not trying to increase the number of physicians, for example. So I'm not trying to see that we may need more physicians on the Saturday, because obviously all these numbers are very constrained. It's, you have a budget constraint, and then you have the ministry who's involved in to determine this number. So I'm only looking at knowing that I have 3 physicians only, so what can I do with that to better match the demand with this number of patients I'm expecting to arrive? So basically, this is the idea of my talk today. So what's the problem is, I'm trying to see how to construct a different ED physician to meet the patient demand. So my objective is obviously, I want to have a better answer to the number of patients who are waiting. I want to have less people waiting. I would like not to have patients leaving without being seen. And I would like to have, if I can, a bit of reduction of the overcrowd. So not having many people waiting outside and not having many people waiting inside as well. So how do we do that? In this paper, we're looking at, so first, if I want to schedule better to meet the patient's demand, I have to understand what's the patient's demand. So how can I predict how many patients I will be having visiting on the Tuesday, 10 a.m., this specific ED? Second, I need to understand, well, knowing that I have 3 patients arriving, how many physicians will I have? So knowing that I have only 1, and knowing that people are not all similar, so I'm gonna say fast and slow, but it doesn't mean fast and slow. I will get back to that. So who's the physician I should put on the Tuesday morning to be able to answer to this demand, basically? And then, like, once I know the demand and then I know my supply, how can I put these 2 together? And to do that, I use a mathematical model to schedule the physicians. You can stop me whenever you want, just saying. So my first step is, we're not the first ones to be looking at how to predict the demand in the ED. I'm going to go very quickly, but I just want you to know that we do have people who have worked, and there are plenty of studies on how to predict the demand and the arrival of patients in the ED. So if you dig a little bit on the literature, you would find a lot, and they basically all end up with pretty much the same curves as the one I will show you. So people are never sick during the weekend. They all get sick on the Monday morning when they get to the ED, and then it decreases a bit during the week. It's pretty stable. And then maybe sometimes on the Friday, if something happens, they will go back to the ED, and then it decreases again. So it's all over the world. It's pretty much the same curve. And whatever models are used, they all tend to show the same numbers. But if you're interested, we can discuss this a bit more later. And the real challenge is that usually we predict on the day of the week, as I just described. We may predict the month of the year, but we do not predict the real hour in the day. And we're trying to find a better way to do that as well. In terms of, so my first problem is how to predict the demand. My second one is, can I measure the productivity of the physicians? So this is very medical oriented, if I can say. And usually the productivity, so there's no, how can I say that? It's not to classify the physicians and say that they're better than the other ones. The productivity is just a number that gives the number of patients I can see in an hour, and then that's all. It doesn't mean that the quality is better or not better. It's just a number that I can use to put inside my mathematical model. So it doesn't mean that having 1 patient an hour is better than having 3, just to make that clear. What we don't have usually in the literature is that it's not, usually, like they would say that in general, in this ED, we would have this productivity, and it's not based on the physicians, and then it's not based on the category or the sections in the ED, and then it's not based on the heaviness of the patients. So for this part, we haven't finished the work yet. It's still ongoing, but like obviously you will think that having a very difficult patient, it's normal to take 1 hour, while for the other, it may take only 25 minutes. Yes?
Quick question. So does the productivity mean, like the number you mentioned? Of course, as you say, it's not comparing the quality. Is it assuming that the quality of the service is the same? So for the same quality of the service, one physician would be handling 3, another would be handling 8? If that's true, then it's not, then you are still comparing the efficiency of the two.
Yes, so the hypothesis is that we have a comparable quality and a comparable service. So if I have one physician seeing one patient, he's providing the same level of service of one physician who's considering 3 patients, for example. But what I have is that I know that if I'm the physician, I can do 3 patients an hour, and maybe if you're the physician, so maybe you can do 5 patients an hour. And this is what we're trying to see at this point.
Okay, so you are de facto comparing the quality of service, the efficiency of it.
Yes, so it's the efficiency, but not the quality. It's really what's related to the numbers and not to the outcome of what happens to the patient. So if I look at the problem, so it's the Sacré-Cœur, just to give you a bit of background. So obviously, an emergency room is open 24 hours 7. You would have either 5 shifts, 10 shifts, depending on how the people they're organized. So you have the day shifts, the evening, and then the night shifts. So this is the D, which is divided into intervals. Sometimes you would have people working 8-hour shifts. Some others may work 10 hours or 12 hours. It just depends on the organization. And on this problem, we're doing something that's very generic. So even though it's based on the case of Sacré-Cœur, because we have worked with different hospitals, we pretty much know all the constraints in the EDs. So we have modeled something that if you're from, I don't know, Saint-Justine, I'm pretty sure there's people from Saint-Justine, well, we're able to solve the problem at Saint-Justine as well. We do have a number of physicians, and obviously each of them has preferences and availabilities. So the availability, is we cannot work because maybe the person is on a conference, and the preferences, it could be pretty much anything. It could be I'm going, I don't want to be on the Tuesday on that room, for example, or it could be just that he doesn't want to work for no additional reason. In this ED, we have 2 sections, and obviously we can include as many sections as needed. There is the acute care and the fast track. And the main reason why we're only considering these 2 sections is that the type of patients you would see on the acute care is really different from the one on the fast track. We have 10 shifts, and so 6 of them are on the acute care and 4 on the fast track. In terms of data, we have used, so it's almost 10 years data that was used to understand what's the prediction of the demand and the productivity of physicians. So obviously, in terms of productivity, we had people leaving, people arriving, so we cleaned that a little bit to have good information. So we are using a 2-step approach. First is for the demand forecast. So if you remember, the demand forecast, I can do something for the day, and for the hour is a bit more complicated. So the first part is really to try to understand the prediction during the day, and then to go deeper into the distribution within the day. So the first part is to estimate the number of patients per day. So we have used, the idea of this project is we have put everything on a USB key to give to the hospital so they're able to use it. So it's one of the reasons why it's not using very difficult or complex methods, because it's supposed to be used and easy to manipulate if needed. So we're using Facebook Prophet to try to determine and to see if on the demand, if I do have patterns. So basically what Facebook Prophet can do is it can look at the seasonality, if there is anything, if it's related to the holidays, if it's related to the day of the week, of the month, and this kind of information. And it uses regression models. And if you want to look at these curves, and as I said, We just basically needed to confirm. We already knew if you ask anybody in the ED, they would be able to predict that the Monday morning is going to be busy. So if you look at during the last 10 years, so I think we should skip the beginning of the first year and the end, because you never know like what happens. You may only have the 2 months or 10 months, but anyway. So you can see that there is an increase in both the fast track and the acute care. So we have split everything in two. If you look at, so we definitely have a trend, and the trend is that it's increasing. In terms of the holidays, so whenever you see this line, it's the New Year's Eve and Christmas, and you know that pretty much during the holidays, you would always have a peak. What you have here is another small one, which is the holidays in the summer. So I don't know what happened in 2012 on that summer, but we had a peak, and on the other one as well. But there's no explanation for that, but it's still going. If you look at the distribution within the week, well, you would have the peak on Monday, as I described earlier, and then it stabilizes a bit, and then you have a decrease during the weekend. And this is true both for the fast track and the acute care area. Yes?
Mind explaining exactly what you're considering as an increase in terms of the year progression, increase in what? The number of patients total?
The number of patients, yes.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we've had since, you're saying from 2000 to present time, an increase of 60%, 70%?
So if I skip here, and then I look just like, if this is, even I can't see. So it's the trend, so this is 60 and this is 66, so you would have an increase of, I don't have the absolute number, so I can't say exactly, it represents how many patients exactly. Yes. Oh, yeah, sorry. So the idea is we're not sure exactly if something happened during those years, so maybe they had an increase of 2 physicians, and then they could see more patients. But this information is not captured in here. But what we know is that we have an increase in the overall number of patients being seen. And maybe the emergency has improved, so now we have less patients leaving without being seen.
And how do you capture patients leaving without being seen? If I don't register with a nurse, then I can leave and nobody will know about it.
Yeah, but usually what patients do, they at least arrive, press the button, and if nothing happens after the button is pressed, you're leaving without being seen. And I think that usually in the EDs, they're pretty good. Oh, yes, of course. Because usually it's in a system. And I think that the EDs are pretty good for those numbers because they have to track that for the ministry. So I think they really do it as well. Okay, so Facebook profile, but yes, sorry. I took my example correctly. Is in the weekend, I know.
So we're kind of like the opposite on the
Yeah. No, I agree. I should have said that this is the adults' problem, and then the kids is a bit different, so. Okay, and then my second step is to look at, so what happens during the day. So that was a bit more difficult because you never know exactly what happens. So basically what we had to end up doing is just to look at the distribution of the number of patients who were inside the ED and who were waiting because they ended up being seen at some point. So we use the distribution within a day to capture, well, how many patients will be arriving. And so I'm using a ratio that will be the demand. So this demand is broken into the day, into the hour, and is dependent on the section of the ED. And what it captures is, in the last 10 years, knowing how many people I saw on the Monday, if I spread them knowing when they were seen and what time they arrived, it would give me pretty much this distribution. So this is the demand prediction we have. So if you look at the two graphs, you have the real demand, and then you have the forecast one. So the dashed one, it shows you that usually we're close. So this is the idea. And it's on the fast track, and on the acute care, it's pretty much the same. We're a bit better on the fast track if you look at like when you have some steps. And so this means that the ratio that we have is very close to the real demand. So once I input the parameter to have the demand, I'm supposed to be good for that. On the productivity, so once again, it has nothing to do with the quality. It's really, should I be putting these people together? So the idea, if you want to look at it, is if I have very quick patients, maybe I want to put them on the Monday morning. If they're not very quick, I don't want to put the whole group on the Monday morning, because as you've seen, then you have a peak. So what you want to do is basically, how should I be mixing physicians with different productivities to better answer my demand at a given point during my week? So my productivity is, we obviously worked with the physicians for this, because we didn't know exactly how you want to count it. And usually, from what we understood is, if it's less than 15 minutes, this is a short visit. If it's somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, this is a normal visit. And if it's over that, then it's a long visit, regardless of if it's half an hour or 2 hours. If you look at these numbers and you look at the distribution within the ED, you would see that half of the patients, basically, they take more than half an hour. And the reason could be anything. It could be waiting for somebody else to come. So this number is calculated from the prise en charge of the patients until the end of the episode. So we have 20% who are short, with an average of 10 minutes, 30% with an average of 22, and then the rest of it is 55 minutes in average. And then the idea is to say, so for one physician, should I consider that these numbers are within the percentage, like is a short visit equivalent to a medium visit or a long visit? So basically, is every minute, are all the minutes have the same value or not? And we worked with the physicians to come up with weights that would say that for a patient who's heavy, which means he will take more time, so the weight between a short and a short visit and a long one is about 50. So if you look at the averages, is very aligned with those numbers. So if I have a lot of heavy patients, you can consider that the duty of the physician is very heavy, and then it would be low for the other ones. And then if you look at, so we're including those weights, and we looked at the variations for all the physicians, and we came up with a productivity number which depends on, so we looked at the days, of course, and then we looked at the shifts, because we thought that maybe people are more efficient on the Monday than on the night shift on Saturday. So we used these numbers to have something that's aligned with the distribution that we're trying to use for the schedule. So we do have this number here that represents for each of the sections, for each of the days, for each of the physicians, how many patients will I be seeing in an hour? And everything is in an hour, so I can compare. If we look at the numbers, so obviously you would think that if I look at the acute care, I'm seeing less patients than on the fast track, because they tend to be heavier. So you have the frequency here, and pretty much you can say that maybe it's 1.5 patients per hour that each of the physician would see on the acute area, and a bit more on the fast track. So somewhere about like around 2.5 and 3 patients that each physician can see. And obviously, this is the mean, because I cannot show the distribution for the physicians in case you know people working in the Sacré-Cœur. So this is why it's very aggregated. If you look at the distribution, you would see that the number of patients seen during the weekend, people tend to be more efficient on the weekends. So the productivity is a bit higher on the weekends if you compare it to the week. So we're capturing this information as well. What you have here is that if I only use, so each minute is pretty much equivalent. So either I'm seeing a light patient or a heavy patient, or if I use the weighted productivity, so I want to give more importance to the heavy patients, you would still have, you would see the two graphs. And this means that for some of the days, I am overestimating the number of patients because I want to give like a bit more weight to the fact that these patients will be heavy. So it depends on the ED if they want to capture that or no. So if I come back to my objective of my mathematical model is I want to reduce the unmet patient demand, and this means that I have 3 patients arriving on the Monday at 11 a.m., and I have 2 physicians, and their productivity ratio is 3, I have no unmet demand. If I do have physicians who can only see 1.5 patients, so my unmet demand is the 1.5. So this is what I'm trying to balance. I'm trying to have the right mix of physicians to make sure I'm always seeing the right number of patients. And what I want to do is, so whoever does scheduling, we know that the client are the physicians. So the client are also the patients through the covering constraint. So I want to make sure that I cover the demand. But if I want my physicians to agree with the schedule I'm giving, I need to make sure that the schedule is good for them as well. And we do that we look at the satisfaction and the unfairness. So the unfairness in the scheduling world is very important. So people, they tend to look at the schedule, and basically what they try to see is, I'm doing 10 weekends, he's doing 6 weekends. I'm doing 75 nights, he's doing 2 nights. So we're trying to look at all these unliked shifts and try to balance these numbers, unless somebody is only on the night duty, for example. That's it. And obviously, we're considering all the constraints, and I will go back to that. So my variables, and I promise there's only 2 slides for that, but I need to explain. So I do have, basically, my problem is to say, I have a physician. I want to know if this physician is working on this day on the day shift, on what section. This is the output of my schedule at the end. And I need to use some additional variables that will help me to evaluate, is it fair or not in terms of scheduling. And for these variables, what I'm trying to do is for each of my constraints where I want to look at the demand, I want to see how patients do I have who will have to wait, and if I have too many physicians, for example, so I don't want to put too many physicians on a shift where nobody is going to be there or less people will be there, because then it's not a good use of my resources. So I'm also looking at these numbers with my Bs. And then I have all the other variables that we'll be looking at. So how many people, each physician will determine how many shifts he wants to have in the horizon, let's say the 28 days. And I'm trying to see if I could reach the target or no. And it's the same for the real distribution of the nights and the weekends and then the evenings. So it's a multi-objective function, which means that I have different criteria and I have to play with that. So how much importance should I be giving to the fact that I want the unmet demand to be decreased compared to the satisfaction of the physicians to be having exactly what they asked for? So I do have criteria for that. But if you look at the function, it's basically the number of shifts, the type of shifts, if it's a day, evening, and night, and received versus asked for. This is in words. And if I look at the real model, this is what it looks like. So I'm just showing the objective function and whatever is linked on my variables. So this constraint is the most important for what we're talking about, which is the demand. So this is my predicted demand. If my B plus is positive, it means that I have too many physicians or not the right mix. And if it's the minus, well, then it means that I'm not reaching my target. And it's the same kind of modeling for the other constraints. So what type of constraints? So like all the others. So we obviously have the supply and demand constraints. So it's the availabilities, the exemptions. So you have, depending on the ED you would be working with, you have plenty of rules. For example, I don't know, if you're more than 60, you don't do night shifts. If you're this and that, then you don't do this type of shift. So all this is obviously included, and we have modeled many constraints, even though they were not used at Sacré-Cœur. We have all the fairness constraints. So usually what we try to do is you do not have 2 consecutive shifts for physicians. They cannot be on the fast track because they don't want to do 2 days of fast track. It's one of the rules that can be changed, obviously. Nobody works 2 consecutive weekends, and in the world of scheduling, it's like the basic constraint, like nobody works 2 weekends in a row. Well, unless really needed. You have all the workload constraints in terms of the number of shifts, on the number of weekends, on how many days can you work, and so on. And then the ergonomic constraints, where usually you would try not to have somebody like working a night shift followed by an evening shift on the following day, and then a day shift, and then a night shift, because then all the cycle is completely mixed up. So all the usual shifts are considered, and I consider these to be the usual because they're like pretty standard, and we're including the exemptions, of course. So what we're trying to look at are, we have the prediction of the demand, we do have the evaluation of the productivity, so how should we put the weights on the objective function to balance the result of my schedule between the fact that my first objective is to reduce the unmet demand, but that I also want to be fair for the physicians. So all these weights here, we worked with the physicians to look at which ones we should be using. And each set of weights is one scenario. So for example, I have one scenario where the understaffing, which means the fact that the demand is not met. So this is very important no matter what. And we have put a scale of 10 times more important for whatever we add. So if we have the overcover and the undercover, the unfairness, so even though the physician satisfaction, the unfairness and the physician dissatisfaction, so if you look at this scenario, for example, it's 10 times more important to have, to meet the demand, and we forget about the physicians. On another scenario, we basically do not consider the physician satisfaction. So this, it would show us like how good we can do with the demand if we do not consider like all the rest. And if we do consider them, what happens? And to be fair, this is the right scenario that we picked with them, because even though it's 10 times more important, it was good enough to capture what physicians want and to still meet the patient demand. So we broke the results and the number into different categories. So basically, if you give that to a solver, it gives you back a number. My number is 960, and obviously nobody knows what 960 means. So we broke it into what's important for the people we're working with. So what's important is, did I uncover shifts? And the answer is no. Because with this ED, for the schedules we tried to do, everybody was pretty much available during the period, so we could cover all the shifts. So this was good. And then we looked at the total uncovered demand. So how many patients or how many slots I could not answer the demand of the patient on the right slot. So you would go from 1,100 to 434. So basically, and of course, the more you put weight on this number, the more this number will decrease. But the more this number will decrease, and the more the satisfaction may also decrease. So like you have to look at these two numbers together. So with the scenario 1, which is basically you just look at the covering the shifts, and then you do not consider anything else. You don't do very well on the patient demand. If we include it, which is what we did in our model, then you would see it decreases a lot. And then you could have on the fast track, it's the same thing. And so obviously the number of patients on the fast track is higher than the number of patients in the acute care, so they will always be higher on this category in terms of spread of the number of patients. And then we have the overcovering. So the overcovering is basically I have too many physicians available, and so it will also decrease or increase depending on the weight I would put on it. And the difference between the, so this is the preferences of the physicians. So for example, if I do not consider the preferences of the physicians, it could be you could end up with a mean of 9 shifts disliked, while if I give it enough weight, you may end up with a 0.11 in average. So somebody has 2 not liked and 1 and so on. If I put all this together, and which is the most important, with the right scenario that we picked, which was S4, the improvements that we could really observe are, in terms of the understaffed shifts, we know that it was a 0% because it was okay. So this is very different from a schedule for the nurses, for example, where you would have a lot of shortages observed, and then you would have to add overtime. In this case, we had no shortage, but sometimes we do. So on this schedule, we were very lucky. If you look at the uncovered demand, so we improved by 10 and by 11%. So basically, we have seen more patients than with mixing the right physicians together. If you looked at the number of shifts creating an imbalance, so this we could improve by 36%. And the cost that we had to pay to improve these numbers was to lose a bit on the allocated shifts. So physicians are not getting exactly the right shifts that they wanted, but it's because it's increasing the patient demand, like the answer to the patient demand. So if we look at the more visual to see what happens, you would have the 3 numbers. So this is my demand, this is my current productivity, and the improved one. So if I was on a perfect world, I would have exactly 3 perfect curves, and I would have like 1 curve for my demand, and I would have the exact same curve for the productivity. But it's not how it works, because once the patient arrives, he takes about 30 minutes maybe to see, so obviously somebody will be waiting. So this is why it's not perfectly aligned, but it's normal. If you look at the demand, and you look at the schedule, so the current productivity, it's this line. So what you want is basically the line 3 to be a bit down and to be a bit closer to the demand. So if you look at the improved productivity, which is the numbers that we're providing with our ratio, it's better, but it's still not perfect. But it's closer to the demand whenever you would have a peak. So you could see on this one here, and then if I look at, for example, this one, let's say, on the weekend one, the demand is very low here, and I'm using physicians, so I'm not having a very high productivity at this point. And then by the end of the day, I'm using different ones just to have it closer to my demand. And this is just 1 shift, of course, from the 12 a.m. to the 11 p.m. There may be an overlap of 2 physicians somewhere in the afternoon. So if I conclude, what we have done here is the usual way to be looking at the scheduling in general is, I know I have a constraint. The usual constraint is a budget constraint that would say I can I need 3 physicians on the day shift, I need 7 on the evening, and so on. What we're trying to do is to keep exactly the same numbers, but to play with the combination of who should be working when, to have a better alignment with the demand. What we have done is to obviously try to have a better prediction and estimation of the demand, so like what I'm doing is better. And we do have a slight deterioration of the equity, of course, because I'm not being very fair to some of the physicians, because I'm trying to move them to maybe where they don't want, but it's only to better cover the demand. So it's like you could see the balance at that point. And one of the advantages of this model is, like, although I'm showing the numbers of Sacré-Cœur, all the inputs and the parameters, you can pretty much just generate different numbers and play with the constraint that you want to add or remove, and you could solve the problem. So if probably someone will ask the question, so I will answer it right away. So are they using this now? So they do have the USB key, so what's left is to just run it, so it takes a bit of work. So it's to run it and then to produce a schedule and try to implement it and see how it will work in the real world. But it doesn't take much. It just takes somebody who's not scared by a computer and to just press the right button to do that. Yes? So we only... Mm-hmm. So on the data, we knew if each physician had a trainee or not. So on the productivity, we're not using the trainee number because then obviously the physicians, they do not see enough patients. So on these numbers, we're only using the real number when the physician is only working. And then on the schedule, like once you want to put a trainee, you have to factor that. So it's really easy to include. Yes.
If you go back a few slides, why is there so much difference in the computation time in some scenarios? Because it's basically the same model. It's just the weight.
It's the weight. You take a multi-criteria, oh yeah, I know. Usually it's the equity. So if you play with the equity, it just becomes a mess in terms of the CPU time. It's exactly the same model, but just because you didn't put the right ones, so because then it doesn't know what to do, basically. It's like the same way to have one shift unwanted in the evening and one shift unwanted for, I don't know, on the acute area. It's the same. It doesn't know what to do. So on the branching, it keeps playing 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So it just increases the number of possibilities. If you remove the fairness, it's almost instantaneous, really, on the solving of these schedules. If you just want to cover the demand, it's very quick. But once you put the equity, and it's not only for physicians, it's whenever you have to put that. Yes?
If scheduling staff wants to like rerun the model, like say there's this USB key, but are you in the solver somehow? So is it like a cloud solution, or do they need the solver in the hospital? Or?
So for this project, and I will have to say for almost all of them, we're using Julia. So Julia is a language that it will allow you to use the solvers that are open. So you don't need to buy any license. You don't need to invest nothing. You just need a laptop and a USB key. You can even do it on a very old Windows machine in a hospital because you run everything on the USB key. So this is how we do it, and it works pretty well. It's a bit slower than Cplex, of course, because it's open solver. So it may take 3 hours instead of half an hour, but it's still very reasonable for a schedule for the next 28 days. I mean, it's okay, we can wait. If we were to solve the planning and very dynamic schedule on who should be replacing what, maybe we would have to look at something else, but at this point it works. So just before I finish, because I'm here and I can do a bit of, there you go. So we're organizing a conference in Montreal, in Saint-Justine, next summer on the, it's between the 29th of May and the 31st. So it's a healthcare systems engineering, and obviously there's proceeding associated at a call for papers for those who are interested. And if you want to submit the paper, it's February, but it's a full paper submission, so it's about 8 to 10 pages. It's focused engineering, data science, and so on. Thank you.